Well, hello and welcome to this English lesson about gigantic things. I'm a little bit gigantic in the frame. Let me zoom out a little bit. Today, we're going to learn about gigantic things. In the world around us, there are things of different shapes and sizes. Some things are small, some things are tiny. I did a lesson about tiny things a couple of weeks ago. Some things are normal size, but some things are big, some things are huge, and some things are gigantic or enormous. And that's kind of the order I use those words in. I usually say that something is big. If it's bigger than that, I might say it's huge. And if it's bigger than that, I might say it's gigantic or enormous. I don't think there's any specific rules about when to use huge, gigantic, or enormous. So that's just my personal order of how I describe very, very, very big things. So once again, welcome to this lesson about gigantic things. I have a lot of gigantic things to talk about in this lesson. Planets. Planets are gigantic. When you think about things that we know and things that we can see, there are planets in our solar system, and a lot of those planets are gigantic. You might say a planet like Pluto. I know some people say Pluto isn't a planet, but when I was in school, we learned that Pluto was a planet. Pluto is relatively small when it comes to planets, but Jupiter and Saturn are gigantic. They are enormous planets. Remember, again, this lesson is about gigantic things, but I'm going to use the word enormous a lot too. Jupiter is a gigantic planet, certainly much bigger than Earth. But if you think about it, compared to humans, every planet in the universe is gigantic, in my opinion. People are not very big when you start comparing us to other things. And do remember, even though some of the words in this English lesson might seem simple and they might be words you know, listen to the other words I use as well. I just used the term solar system. I said Jupiter, Saturn, Pluto. So do remember that even though I'm talking about just one word that you might know, there might be a few other words you can learn along the way. Moons. So Earth has one moon. Obviously, the moon is smaller than the Earth, but it's still gigantic in my opinion. Some planets have multiple moons. I believe Jupiter has a number of moons. I don't know how many, but moons as well are big. They're gigantic. If we wanted to live on the moon is big enough that we could go to the moon and we could build a moon base. We could actually build a place on the moon where we could live. So far, we've visited the moon. So far, we have space stations that orbit the Earth that people live on. But as yet, no one has really gone to live on the moon long term. Maybe that will happen in my lifetime. We'll see. And then stars, if you didn't know this, the sun is actually a star. Stars are quite big. The sun is enormous. The sun is gigantic. And it's also very, very hot. Whales. When you start to talk about animals, we have animals like a whale. A whale, I think the blue whale might be the largest animal on Earth. And the elephant might be the largest land animal. So we kind of distinguish between animals that live in the ocean and animals that live on land. So the whale, or a number of different whales, kinds of whales, are some of the biggest, if not the biggest animals on the planet. If you were in a boat and if a whale jumped out of the water, you would definitely use the word gigantic. You would say, oh, that was a gigantic whale. And when that whale jumped out of the water and landed, there was a gigantic splash of water as well. But yes, definitely whales are enormous sea creatures, and elephants are definitely enormous land animals, or animals that live on land. Towers. So here is the Eiffel Tower. Towers are these things humans build because we want to see how tall we can make something and how beautiful we can make it look. So around the world, there are different towers. In Toronto, there's something called the CN Tower. So if I drive about an hour and a half from here, I can see the CN Tower. The CN Tower is quite tall, and I would say it's gigantic. Every year, I think just once a year, there's a race. You can use the stairs to go to the top, and some people walk to the top of the CN Tower. That would be you would use a gigantic amount of energy to climb that gigantic tower. But towers, humans for a very long time have had this crazy desire to build incredibly gigantic towers, incredibly tall towers. So again, I'm using tall and gigantic. So you'll see that gigantic can be used to mean something really big, but I can also use it to talk about something that's really tall. You could say, "Whoa, that tower is gigantic." So it has a couple of slightly different meanings there. And then oceans. So around the planet, we live on a planet where there's a lot of water. And oceans are huge bodies of water. Remember how I said the vocabulary might be simple, but I'm going to use other words as I describe it. So an ocean is considered a body of water. Oceans are huge. There's the Atlantic Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, the Arctic Ocean, the Indian Ocean. Trying to think of all these different oceans that there are. But the ocean is so gigantic that for a long time, people did not regularly cross the oceans in boats. It wasn't until fairly recently, in the last few hundred years, that people regularly and safely started to cross the ocean in ocean-going vessels. Okay, there's another term for you. An ocean-going vessel is a boat that is able to cross the ocean. So oceans, definitely huge, definitely gigantic. Mountains. So in Canada, where I live, there aren't any mountains. In Western Canada, we have the Rocky Mountains, and they are gigantic. I have seen the Rocky Mountains a few times in my life. In fact, my brother-in-law and sister-in-law used to live out west. And so when we visited them, we would see the Rocky Mountains, and they are gigantic. They're so big, they're so tall that my brother-in-law and I went skiing. We went downhill skiing in July one year. We went to a local mountain to hike, and we realized the ski slopes at the top were open. So we came back the next day and we skied all day. It was a super fun day. Bridges. So there are bodies of water that sometimes people can't cross, and so we build bridges. When we started building bridges hundreds of years ago, they were pretty tiny. Maybe a small footbridge, maybe just a small suspension bridge that people could walk across. But eventually we built cars, and we needed a way to get cars across bridges, and trains. So we built trestle bridges, we built suspension bridges, we built all kinds of bridges to cross usually water, but sometimes just a valley or ravine. But bridges have become gigantic. There's actually a bridge in Eastern Canada that goes all the way from the coastline to this island of Prince Edward Island. So this enormous bridge. I forget the name of it. Bridge to PEI. The Confederation Bridge, 12.9 kilometers long. The longest bridge in the world over ice-covered water. So there you go. This is not the Confederation Bridge, by the way. But yes, bridges. Some of them are gigantic. Cargo planes. So one of the biggest planes in the world, I believe, is a cargo plane. I'm not 100% sure. In order to bring lots of things from one country to another, or to move them within a country, we will often use cargo planes. A cargo plane is different than a passenger plane. A cargo plane is usually used just for things. Maybe it's filled with cars. Maybe it's filled with military equipment. Maybe the cargo plane is filled with a whole bunch of iPads coming to my country to be sold to Canadians. But cargo planes are full of cargo. So again, cargo is anything that needs to be shipped. So interesting thing here. We use the verb to ship to talk about whenever we send stuff. So if I bought a t-shirt online, they would ship it to me. We even use the word when talking about cargo planes. So you would say, My t-shirt is, my t-shirt was shipped, they shipped it via cargo plane. So it didn't go on an actual ship, it went on a plane, but we use the verb ship to talk that way. Passenger planes, we are all familiar with these. A passenger plane can be gigantic. Some are small. I mean, they're all big, but some are relatively small, but some are gigantic. A Boeing 757 is huge. An Airbus, I want to say 380. What's the biggest Airbus? Biggest Airbus. Airbus A380 is a gigantic plane. So definitely we have really learned how to make planes well as a civilization. Container ships. So there are a number of different kinds of ships. There are a lot of cruise ships in the world, but there are also a lot of container ships. So a container ship has a lot of containers on it. All of these things on this ship are called containers. It is how we ship the vast majority of products on this planet. So there are container ships continually moving around the world. When a container ship got stuck in the Suez Canal, it affected the whole world because we all rely on container ships to get certain things. If I want to buy a car that's made in Japan, we can buy Japanese cars in Canada. It comes on a container ship. If for some reason that ship can't make it across the ocean, it really affects the world's economy. So container ships and cruise ships. So a cruise ship is more for fun and for enjoyment. I have never been on a cruise ship. I'm not sure I ever will go on a cruise ship. We'll see. But a cruise ship, what's a good way to describe this? Like a floating hotel? That might be a good way to describe it. A cruise ship is a gigantic ship filled with people who are sailing from port to port in order to visit different countries. It's very popular for Canadians to go on cruise ships that leave from Florida in the United States and go through the Caribbean or the Caribbean, there's two words to say it, and visit all the different islands. So a lot of Canadians will, in the winter, drive or fly to Florida, the state of Florida in the southern US, and then take a cruise ship on a cruise through the Caribbean or the Caribbean. It's the same place, by the way. I just say it two different ways. Hot air balloons. Now, these aren't necessarily gigantic, but when you see one up close, it seems gigantic. It's really fun to see a gigantic hot air balloon up close, unless you are one of Jen's friends also grows flowers, and a hot air balloon made an emergency landing in her flower field and mushed or crushed a lot of her flowers a few years ago. So then seeing a hot air balloon up close wouldn't be exciting if it was damaging your if it was damaging your flowers that you were growing. Machines or machinery. So we kind of use these two words interchangeably. A farm has a lot of machinery. They have tractors and they have wagons and they have what's called a combine to harvest things. You could also call it a harvester, a combine harvester. Machines and machinery. Again, we use the two words interchangeably, like the farmer bought a lot of machines or the farmer bought a lot of machinery. Have you seen a newer tractor? Have you seen how gigantic tractors have become? Here's a funny story. I have a tractor that I thought was a big tractor, but it's actually now considered to be a medium-sized tractor because tractors have become so enormous and gigantic over the last 20 years that people no longer consider my tractor to be a very big tractor. So people. So this is an interesting usage case. We don't often use the word gigantic unless we're talking about extremely big men with lots of muscle. Okay. So here's when I hear the word gigantic. If you're watching the Olympics and you're watching the men's weightlifting, you might say that guy is gigantic. We don't often use the word gigantic to talk about women. I'm not sure why, But if you're watching the heaviest weight class in a boxing match, you might say a men's boxing match, you might say, oh, the fighter from Belgium, he's gigantic. What you mean then is that that person has a lot of muscle. You're also saying they're probably quite tall. But if you see someone like this, I think this is an actor. I think he was in Game of Thrones. I'm not sure. But you would say, not to the person. You wouldn't walk up and say, you're gigantic. But you might say to a friend, do you see that guy? He's gigantic. Meaning that has a lot of muscle, very physically fit, and huge. Yeah, you would use that word as well. So this one's a little gross, so look away if you don't want to look. Sometimes on our faces, we get things that we call zits or pimples. We use the word zit a lot in Canadian English, and high schoolers often get these, or teenagers, but sometimes I'll get a zit too. It's not uncommon for me to do an English lesson and there's like a small red spot somewhere on my face. We call this a zit. And even though a zit is actually tiny, when you get a zit, often people will say, it's picture day at school and I have a gigantic zit on my forehead, or I'm going on a date and I just realized I have a gigantic zit on my face. So even though the zit is actually small, we use the word gigantic to describe it. I'm going to make this picture smaller because it's grossing me out a bit. We use the word gigantic because of how it makes us feel. It makes us feel a little bit embarrassed. Mistakes. Sometimes you make a gigantic mistake. Sometimes you make an enormous mistake or a huge mistake. One might be that you accidentally drove your car in the ditch because you turned the wrong way or something. You made a gigantic mistake. A gigantic mistake that I recently saw someone do is they forgot what day their exam was. A student came to school a day later and their exam was actually the day before. So that would be a gigantic mistake. That would definitely be a gigantic mistake for sure. Icebergs. If you have ever been on a ship in the North Atlantic, you would most likely have seen icebergs. I have never seen an iceberg in real life. It is a mystery to me what they actually look like up close. So notice again, I'm using the phrase up close. When you see something up close, it means that you're close to it. Sometimes if you see a person in the distance, you don't recognize them until you get up close and then you can see who they are. So I've never seen an iceberg in real life. I've only seen pictures, and I've never seen an iceberg up close. That would be fun someday to do that. Trees. So hopefully I say this one right. In the Western United States, there are trees called sequoia, and they are the biggest trees in the world, I think. They are gigantic. If you look here, these people are standing in front of one, and I would dare say this isn't even the biggest tree in the world. But trees can be gigantic. In Canada, we have gigantic trees. We have gigantic maple trees in some places. Close to me, there's one of the oldest maple trees in Ontario, my province. And you can't put your arms around it. Like I think you need 4 or 5 people to join hands to put your arms around the whole tree. So trees definitely are things that can be gigantic. Storms. Last night, we actually had a really bad storm here. As I was driving home last night, the storm was so bad, the rain was so intense that I had to drive 40 kilometers an hour. And it was also starting to get dark. And the person in front of me didn't have any lights on their trailer or on the back of their vehicle. Their brake lights were broken. So I was in a really bad rainstorm, and it was gigantic. I drove for half an hour and I was still in the storm. So it was, well, it normally would have been a half hour, but it took me longer. But we do have gigantic storms. It seems that the last couple of summers, we've had more and more gigantic storms. If you remember on my farm last summer, we had a gigantic storm and my willow tree broke and a big branch was hanging in the background of my videos for a month or two until I finally cleaned it up. But yes, we definitely have, it seems like, more and more gigantic storms in the summers here. Buildings. So I'm not sure this is a competition, but we certainly have been building some gigantic buildings in the world in the last 10, 20, or 30 years. Sometimes you will see a building and you'll say, that's a really tall building. But sometimes it's just gigantic. Like a gigantic building would be just way taller than any other building in that city. So certainly I know on the edge of Central Park in New York, there's a really gigantic apartment building right now that's either being built or almost finished. So I do not own a mansion, but some mansions are gigantic. Are all mansions gigantic? Possibly. A mansion is an enormous house. A mansion is a gigantic house that a multimillionaire or a billionaire would own. The reason I use the word multimillionaire is because these days, if you're a millionaire, you're not going to buy a mansion. You'll probably just have a nice house. You might have a big house. But if you are a multimillionaire, that means you have more than $1 million. You have 20 million or 30 million or $50 million. You might buy a mansion. Certainly, if you are a billionaire, you will most likely own a mansion. So again, a mansion is just a really, really, really big house, a gigantic house. Farms. So in the United States and in Canada, most farms are now gigantic. Here's a term for you. Many years ago, there were a lot of family farms. A family farm is a small farm, maybe 100 acres, maybe 200 acres. I know that might seem big to you, but when I was a kid, almost all of my friends lived on a farm. There were a lot of family farms. So the parents and the kids had cows or pigs or chickens, and the farm was just big enough for a family to do all the work. Now, a lot of farms are gigantic. They are actually called agribusinesses. They are enormous farms, thousands of acres, and there's more than just a family working there. Sometimes a gigantic farm will be 3 or 4 families, like a brother and 2 sisters, and all of their kids will run a farm. So maybe, so the one gigantic farm I know, one brother and his wife have 4 kids. The other sister and her husband have 3 kids. The other sister and her husband have 2 kids, and they all run a gigantic farm. And some are just businesses. They're just owned and run by a boss who hires lots of employees. Signs and billboards. So this is the Hollywood sign. Apparently I'm not sure I'm allowed to show this, but I found a royalty-free picture, so I will. The Hollywood sign is gigantic. I think if you were up close, the letters are way bigger than you are as a person. But a sign, and then the signs you see along a highway are called billboards. So this is a billboard, and some billboards are definitely gigantic. I see more billboards when I'm in Michigan than I do in Canada. I'm not sure if we have stricter laws in Canada about billboards, but when I'm in Michigan, there are a lot of billboards along the highway. Not as many in Canada for some reason. So there's something called a roadside attraction or a tourist attraction, and different cities in the world have decided to build extra big things as tourist attractions. So this is called an Adirondack chair. This is what we call this type of chair. Normally it's human size, but this one is extra big. So some places have decided to build a really big pencil. There's a place in Canada where they mine nickel, and so they have a gigantic, sorry, this isn't a nickel, but this is some money. They have a gigantic nickel in Sudbury, Ontario. So a tourist attraction or a roadside attraction, these are sometimes gigantic. They decide to build something gigantic for people to look at and for people to see. So spiders and bugs are actually quite small, but we use the word gigantic when we see one that's extra scary and bigger than you would expect or bigger than normal. So just last night, we were selling bouquets of flowers and there was a spider in one, and the girl said, "There's a gigantic spider in there." And I laughed, which wasn't nice, but I laughed because I knew I was going to talk about gigantic spiders today. People who are afraid of spiders, when they see a big spider, will often say, there's a gigantic spider. Don't go in that room. There's a gigantic spider. And sometimes when we are sitting around a campfire, mosquitoes will bite us. And sometimes there'll be a really big mosquito and we'll say, "Oh, that's a gigantic mosquito." Malls. So I believe this is the Mall of America. There's also in Canada something called the West Edmonton Mall in Edmonton. I think it's still called that. I'll have to check. Malls can be gigantic. When I go to the city close to me, the mall there is big. It's a big mall, but it's not enormous. It's not gigantic. There is a mall though in Toronto, and I can't remember the name, and it's gigantic. You could literally, if you track your steps, you could get your 10,000 steps just by shopping in that mall because the mall is gigantic. So again, a mall is a shopping mall. It's a collection of stores, usually indoors. Like 99% of the time, a mall is something where you are indoors. We do have outdoor malls in this part of Canada, though. There's one in Niagara Falls. But a mall, depending on where you are, could be described as gigantic. Stadiums and auditoriums. So if you go watch soccer, or what most of you call football, you probably go to a gigantic stadium. I think soccer stadiums are the biggest stadiums in the world. They're definitely bigger than a hockey arena or a basketball arena. Football stadiums, though, in America might also be, I think maybe the biggest stadium in the world is in Texas. Everything is gigantic in Texas. That's a little bit of a joke. If you're from Texas, I'm not trying to insult you, but I should ask Brent about this someday. But for some reason, the state of Texas in the US, in North America, we always imagine everything in Texas is gigantic. Stadiums are gigantic, and etc. I don't know where that came from, but that's a common thing. Auditoriums. So an auditorium is where you would go in order to hear a concert. Maybe you've bought tickets to the opera. You would go to an auditorium. That would be the place that you would go in order to hear that concert or to see the thing you bought tickets for. Lenses. So I was at a sports event, a high school sports event, and there was a photographer there, and the lens on his camera was even bigger than this one. And so sometimes when you have a camera, I can't show you because my camera's right there. When you have a camera, it has a little lens on it or a big lens on it, but sometimes it will have an enormous lens or a gigantic lens. Usually these lenses are used for sporting events or for taking pictures of wildlife. If you were a wildlife photographer, you probably have a gigantic lens because you want to be able to take pictures of the wild animals from far away, especially if they're dangerous. The same is true for sports photographers. You can't be on the field to take a good picture. You need to be far away so that you don't disturb the game. So you most likely will have a gigantic lens. And then I'm going to end with this slide, the universe. So all around us, there are planets, there are stars, there are galaxies. All of those things are gigantic. But the universe is the word we use to talk about everything that exists. So the universe is the most gigantic thing in the world. There's nothing bigger than the universe because everything is part of the universe.